Good morning, everyone. Honoured guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, szanowni państwo. First of all, I'd like to thank Pan Director Nawrocki for his kind invitation to address this important event. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here in Gdańsk and talking about this vitally important subject, of course, on the 80th anniversary of the signature of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. I wish us all enlightening presentations and stimulating discussions. In the early hours of the 23rd of August 1939, in the bowels of the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin raised a glass to Adolf Hitler. He knew how much the German people loved their Führer, he told the assembled dignitaries, and he proposed a toast, describing Hitler in the process as Maladiec, a thoroughly good chap. The drinking and the toasting had followed the vital business of the evening, the signature of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, one of the most important and least understood, I would argue, political alignments of the Second World War. At first sight, the Nazi-Soviet Pact appears to be just what it says it is, a simple non-aggression pact between two states who, like the many countries before them who had signed similar agreements in the 1930s, promised to refrain from the use of force in their bilateral relations. Away from the rather anodyne text of the treaty, however, the devil, or as we've heard, the two devils, lay in the detail, specifically in the secret protocol that was appended to the pact, the document by which Central Europe, Poland, the Baltic states, Romania and Finland, was to be divided between Moscow and Berlin in the event of what was euphemistically described as a future territorial rearrangement. This protocol alone, though barely a page in length, would directly impact some 40 million people. Rarely, one might speculate, has a treaty's word count been so hideously inversely proportional to its body count. More broadly, the pact opened the way for 22 months of sometimes uneasy German-Soviet cooperation and collaboration. More broadly still, the pact gave Hitler the green light that he wanted for launching his invasion of Poland on September the 1st, thereby spawning World War II in Europe and the territorial rearrangement to which the protocol had alluded. The Nazi-Soviet Pact is profoundly significant, therefore. I would say it is impossible to properly understand the opening phase of the war in Europe without understanding it. Yet, in most of the non-specialist literature, and especially in the English language, it is routinely ignored, cast almost as a footnote, nothing more than the last diplomatic chess move before the outbreak of war. As we know, ladies and gentlemen, it's much more than that. Indeed, I would suggest that it is the forgotten great power relationship of World War II. Hitler and Stalin never met, and on a personal level, their correspondence was limited to a few congratulatory telegrams and birthday best wishes. But the relationship between their two regimes was no less substantial, despite the absence of that personal connection. And it was predicated on three main areas, in order of significance: military cooperation, economics, and grand strategy. Militarily, the Germans and the Soviets generally kept a distance from one another. Stalin's neutrality in the war was far too politically precious to him to risk being compromised by open cooperation with Hitler. Consequently, the Red Army and the Wehrmacht tended to avoid one another during their respective invasions of Poland in 1939. Indeed, they were instructed to maintain a 25-kilometre distance between them wherever possible. Of course, this did not prevent instances of more remote cooperation, such as the establishment of the Basis Nord U-boat supply base near Murmansk, or the radio signals from Minsk that were broadcast to aid the navigation of Luftwaffe bombers. When the two sides did meet, whether by accident or design, relations could be unpredictable. They famously conducted a joint parade, a military parade, to mark the handover of the city of Brest to Soviet control on the 22nd of September 1939, with General Heinz Guderian and his Red Army counterpart Semyon Krivoshin smiling broadly for the newsreel cameras. Yet relations were not always so apparently cordial. Even at Brest, Guderian was irritated by Soviet demands for a speedy German withdrawal, and Krivoshin was evidently a very prickly customer who was resolutely unwilling to be impressed by the superiority of German forces. Elsewhere in Poland in 1939, German troops were often very wary of Soviet soldiers, and in some instances even implored local populations to join them in withdrawing westward when they were obliged to cede territory to their new ally. Soviet soldiers reciprocated, the animosity of the previous decade seemingly hard to dislodge. As one Red Army officer complained during the invasion of Poland, "We know who the real enemy is." It's no surprise then that the two sides briefly came into conflict in the outskirts of Lvov in 1939, and even issued rules of engagement to avoid accidental friendly fire incidents, with the German side, for instance, requesting that the Red Army avoid nighttime attacks, a tactic favoured by the Poles. As one Polish colonel commented during the September campaign, they certainly made for very strange allies. The sphere of economics was much more significant. Indeed, it could be regarded as the very foundation of that wider relationship. The first German-Soviet economic agreement was signed on the 20th of August 1939, 3 days before the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And for the Soviets, at least, it was a rather essential precondition for its political counterpart. That treaty was followed by 2 further economic agreements, each one promising more than the last, essentially exchanging German military and industrial technology for Soviet raw materials. In one of those treaties, the list of Soviet requests ran to 42 typewritten pages and encompassed everything from locomotives, piston rings, gun sights and blast furnaces to complete tanks and aircraft, including 5 Messerschmitt 109s, a Panzer Mark III, and a prototype helicopter. The mutual benefits of these arrangements are obvious. Germany got to avoid the worst effects of the expected British blockade, a tactic that had worked spectacularly well in the First World War, by having access particularly to Soviet oil and grain. The USSR, meanwhile, received a huge boost from German technological expertise to aid its ongoing breakneck industrialization program. Both sides naturally lauded the results. Molotov praised one of the treaties as the largest ever signed by the Soviet Union, much larger, he added pointedly, than anything that had ever been arranged with the British or the French. One German negotiator, meanwhile, referred to the same treaty as more important to Germany than a battle won. Despite the hyperbole, mutual suspicions proved difficult to surmount, and a good proportion of that economic boon that was expected was never realized, and became a major source of frustration for the German side. The last major motivating factor to consider, I suggest, is what we might call grand strategy. It might seem perverse to speak of a coordination of strategic goals between Berlin and Moscow at this time, especially when one recognizes that their long-term ideological goals were predicated on the defeat and elimination of the other. Yet, in a most basic sense, the two sides certainly concurred in a willingness to use war to achieve their strategic and ideological objectives. For Hitler, war was quite simply an article of fascist faith, the crucible of all that was good and noble as he saw it in Nazi society. Stalin, meanwhile, was moved by a variant of the revolutionary defeatism that had brought the Bolsheviks to power as Russia had crumbled 2 decades before. War, he believed, could be the driver of fundamental political change, and a war between Germany and the Western powers would naturally serve to destabilize both, making them ripe for collapse and the ultimate and inevitable victory of communism. His thinking was crystallized in Politburo discussions in the late summer of 1939, when he said, "A war is on between 2 groups of capitalist countries for the redivision of the world, for the domination of the world. We see nothing wrong in their having a good hard fight and weakening one another. It would be fine if, at the hands of Germany, the position of the richest countries were to be shaken. Hitler, without realizing it, is shaking and undermining the capitalist system itself." Beyond the utility of war, the Germans and Soviets coincided in their desire for territorial expansion, and specifically in their antipathy towards the existence of an independent Poland. Both were revisionist powers who saw large parts of the restored Poland as part of their lost lands and as an obstacle to their territorial ambitions. Already at the time of the Rapallo Pact of 1922, German General Hans von Seeckt had advised the then German Chancellor that the existence of Poland was incompatible with Germany's vital interests, and suggested then that the logical basis for German-Russian cooperation was that Poland should be made to disappear. On this point, at least, nothing much had changed by 1939. Hitler saw Poland as the first phase of his plan for Lebensraum, the greater German empire to be created at the expense of all those whom he considered to be racially inferior. Stalin, meanwhile, benefited from Hitler's largesse, from Hitler's generosity in signing away lands that were not his to give: Eastern Poland, Bessarabia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Nonetheless, at the stroke of a pen, Stalin gained almost all of the lands that had been lost in the aftermath of the First World War by Russia. He wasted little time in incorporating them into the Soviet Union. Of course, the fact that the relationship between Hitler and Stalin was a marriage of mutual convenience does not make it any less of a relationship. Many relationships, even international ones, are marriages of convenience, and the mere fact of their convenience does not diminish their significance. The two sides certainly had ample opportunities to get to know one another, for good or ill. Take, for example, the Soviet purchasing commissions that were sent to Germany to peruse the wares of German industrial and military giants, Krupp, Henschel, and others, ostensibly to decide what to include on their economic wish lists, but also to indulge in some industrial-grade industrial espionage. Or take the joint NKVD-Gestapo commissions that toured occupied Poland to decide on the fate of those Poles, displaced persons, POWs, and others who applied to be transferred between their respective zones of occupation and annexation. Or take the German Admiral Otto Feiger, who went to Leningrad to oversee the fitting out of the former German heavy cruiser Lutzow, which had been sent to the USSR as part of the 1940 commercial agreement, and found himself on the receiving end of an NKVD sting operation involving, as Khrushchev would later describe it, a young lovely and some photographic equipment. Though Admiral Feiger might have disagreed, such was the interconnected nature of the two regimes during the period of the Nazi-Soviet Pact that the importance of the relationship to both sides is surely incontrovertible. For both Hitler and Stalin, the pact bore considerable fruit. Hitler got carte blanche to wage his war against Poland, as well as a beneficial economic arrangement. From Stalin's perspective, meanwhile, the constellation of power engendered by the pact was optimal. He had regained Russia's lost territories, secured an excellent economic deal, and had the pleasure of seeing his ideological enemies mired in war, a conflict from which the Soviet Union had everything to gain. For Stalin, certainly, the Nazi-Soviet Pact was win-win. Consequently, I would argue that for Hitler, the 22-month relationship to Stalin was infinitely more central to his ambitions than the relationship to Mussolini, his Axis partner and closest ally. For Stalin, meanwhile, the relationship to Hitler, though hugely beneficial in the short term, threatened to define him and his regime after Hitler attacked in 1941, all of which goes some way to explaining why the Soviet Union went to such extraordinary lengths to deny, obfuscate, and relativize the reality of the pact to the end of its days. Of course, like all relationships, Hitler and Stalin's marriage of convenience had to come to an end. And it ended on the 22nd of June 1941 when the Wehrmacht invaded the USSR. The reasons for this collapse are many. The economic benefits promised by the relationship had scarcely materialized, for Germany at least, and the strategic rationale of 1939 had largely vanished with the fall of France in 1940. Stalin had wanted a Nazi-Soviet Pact Mark II, a reset of the relationship, and had sent Molotov to Berlin in November 1940 to negotiate. But already by that point, the Germans were eyeing new targets. Essentially, for Hitler, the arrangement with Stalin was only ever going to be temporary. And once the constellation of power that had created the pact had evaporated, as it did in 1940, he was bound to reconsider his options. June 1941 ushered in the bloodiest conflict in history. But it was also, on one level, a showdown between criminals. Criminals who had divided Eastern Europe between them and now fell out over the division of the spoils. It was akin to two Chicago gang bosses fighting it out to decide who was going to be the capo dei capi, the boss of all the bosses. So even as that brief tour of the horizon will demonstrate, it's clear that the 22-month period of the currency of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, from August 1939 to June 1941 saw a great power relationship emerge between the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And yet, this is a relationship that history, in the English-speaking narrative particularly, has largely neglected to remember. While the bookshop shelves groan with learned tomes about the Grand Alliance, or about Churchill's relationship to Roosevelt, or about Hitler's curious love affair with Mussolini, one searches largely in vain for similar treatments of Hitler and Stalin. There are many reasons for this. For all its strengths in other fields, Anglophone historiography still tends to suffer from Chamberlain's myopic worldview that saw Eastern Europe as a faraway place about which we know nothing. And it tends to regard everything east of the River Elbe as a mysterious terra incognita. It's worth mentioning here, perhaps, that when I consulted my son's history school book a few years ago, when I was writing the book Pact Diabłów, to see how the pact was mentioned, I was rather shocked to see that it got precisely 5 lines, all of which were centered on the diplomacy of August 1939. There was no mention of the 22-month relationship, no mention of the annexations, of the trade treaties, of the deportations, of the occupations that followed. Russian historiography is little better, preferring to obfuscate and dissemble rather than face the ugly truth of the pact. Indeed, it was a line that tended until very recently to largely attempt to juxtapose the pact with the Munich Treaty in an apparent exercise in tu quoque, you did it too, you also made a deal with Hitler, suggesting that a failed and flawed attempt to salvage peace from totalitarian aggression in 1938, the Munich Treaty, was in some way comparable to a pact that paved the way for wholesale totalitarian aggression in 1939. In this regard, things are perhaps changing, but with only glacial speed. The recent Russian publication of the text of the secret protocol, for example, seems positive. However, the cynic in me tends to see it more as an attempt to control a narrative which has been running out of Russian control, rather than an honest assessment of a difficult past. German historiography, meanwhile, has problems all of its own, not least the all-consuming culture of mea culpa, in which the justifiable horror and shame for the crimes of Nazism has seemingly morphed into an occasional inability to admit to the misdeeds of others, lest they be construed as a diminution, as a lessening of one's own guilt. Yet, as any objective reading of this period will reveal, there were very definitely 2 devils and 2 diabolical regimes at play, not one. Mea culpa does not have to mean mea omnia culpa. Add to all that the tendency for simplification. History is complicated, we know that, but the version that is rendered for public consumption in popular history books, television documentaries, and school textbooks is too often a boiled down, straightened out, distilled narrative, with many of its complexities, ambiguities, and shades of grey removed. More seriously, popular history often presents its subjects in terms of a moral binary, a world of heroes and villains, good and evil, right and wrong. It's very easy to see how this is a difficult environment in which to discuss the political complexities and moral depravities of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. So our subject for this conference has something of an image problem. It is complex. It is difficult sometimes to explain. And consequently, it slips all too easily through the cracks in the historical record, in the public mind at least. I was vividly reminded of this when I was writing The Devil's Alliance, the Pact Diabłów, a few years ago, and I was asked by an acquaintance what I was working on. I replied I was working on a book on the Nazi-Soviet Pact. My friend looked baffled for a moment and then said, "Oh, was there one?" This is the problem that we face, and it's our job, ladies and gentlemen, starting today, to seek to rectify this deficit. Thank you very much.